Okay, folks, we're live.
Great. Thank you, Shivani. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm just going to start. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today at the third Panoptic Talk event. This event is being conducted under IFF's Project Panoptic, which is India's first facial recognition systems tracker that aims to bring transparency and accountability to the development and deployment of these systems, while also advocating for policy change. One of the reasons we launched Project Panoptic was that there was very little conversation around how harmful this technology is and how it's being developed and used in India. We wanted to raise awareness about this issue and through our project inform people about the secretive nature of the deployment of this surveillance technology. With the Panoptic Talks series, we aim to take this forward by calling experts from India and abroad to discuss the intricacies of the ethical, legal, and technical ramifications of this technology, and to ensure that IFF's community and the larger audience can benefit from the experience from those who work tirelessly on this issue. Today, we have with us Haripriya Suresh from the News Minute, Nirmal John from Economic Times Prime, and Reena Chandran from the Thomson Reuters Foundation. So happy to have all of you here. I'm just going to talk about your individual organizations a bit. As you all know, the News Minute is an excellent independent digital news platform based in Bangalore that mainly covers news from South India. ET Prime is a members-only business storytelling platform from the House of Economic Times. And the Thomson Reuters Foundation has a global editorial team of almost 50 journalists and about 300 freelancers who cover the world's underreported stories at the heart of aid, development, women's and LGBT rights, human trafficking, property rights, climate change, and social innovation. Therefore, today, what I want to do is I want to get the local, the national, and the international insight into how transparency around the deployment of facial recognition is faring at each of these levels, because all three of our panelists are excellent journalists who've been working on this issue for quite some time. So thank you all for being here. And I'm going to start with Haripriya. Haripriya, you're covering the spread of facial recognition in the cities of South India, like Hyderabad and Bangalore. Did it surprise you at first when you started covering this technology about how wide it has spread with little to no public conversation around it? And why do you think people know so little about this technology, which is spreading through their cities?
First, thank you for that introduction. And yes, initially, I think I was a bit surprised about how much it was. Like, I'm someone who grew up in Hyderabad, and growing up, I had no idea, unless I actually started reporting on it. But I think it's also in recent times, they've used that technology more and more for a lot more purposes as well. And I think the reason people know so little about it, I mean, they do read the news reports that say, facial recognition has been started for, say, airport verification, or whether they're trying it out for e-voting or for ration cards, things like that. But I think they're also just viewing it as, okay, it's a news item. Very often they're also just PR items that says, oh, here's a tech innovation that's been started for whatever purpose. But I don't think they realize how it affects them on a macro level, like whether when they leave their house to go to their office, do they know how many cameras are actually on them in that distance, or that their steps can be retraced, how it'll affect their lives. I think the people are not aware of how it can affect them on a micro level, one. Two, I think people tend to, and the conversation that keeps coming up is, you have nothing to hide, so why do you have a problem with it? But I think people tend to equate privacy with secrecy, and that there's no individual autonomy there at all. They're just like, it's fine, because they don't understand that they can, like, the pitfalls of surveillance can also be on them. They just assume it's going to be for criminal elements and it's for the better of the city or law enforcement or whatever it is. But they don't realize that every citizen can be tracked, and at some point it can knock on their door as well. Because I think privilege affords that kind of bubble where it tends to affect minority communities more or underprivileged communities more than it does the privileged. So you don't see that level of outrage simply because they're like, I have nothing to hide, because other people have something to hide, which is why they're asking for privacy. So which is where I think we have to do a better job in sense of telling people how it affects them on a micro level, and why it's not the greatest idea for the government or law enforcement to be able to retrace every single step of yours, no matter where you are and what you're doing.
I think the issue there is the assumption that the government can do no wrong, which I think is very worrying because, as we've seen, all governments, even democratic governments, have a tendency to retain power and to do anything to retain power, right? So it's not necessary that a government, even if it's been elected democratically, will not violate fundamental rights or anything like that. And coming to that, while you've been working on your stories, you also interacted with government officials, I'm assuming. So you must have talked to them about facial recognition. Do they even understand what the technology is, or do they understand how it works, and what are the pitfalls of the technology?
I think the people who are putting these systems into place for various things, I think they very well know what they're doing. I think the general assumption is that people look at it as a flashy new technology that they're going to take it. But I think when they're actively putting facial recognition systems in place I think Telangana has about 7 systems currently. I think they very well know what they're doing it for. I think there's a general assumption that they don't. But I also, like you mentioned, that they're very comfortable with the idea that we're the government and we have our own internal checks and balances and we can do no wrong. And I think they see pitfalls, but they're like, oh, this is just critics and criticism, and you just want to keep talking about how we don't do our jobs, and then we do our jobs and it's going to be a problem. But yes, I think they very well know that what they're going to do. And if you say pitfalls, they're going to be like, we're not going to use it to make a life or death decision, but overall, this is helping make our jobs better and more efficient and easier. So the public good of it outweighs the bad is what I've heard generally, at least so far.
That's extremely worrying. But I also want to understand if that's only a Hyderabad view, or is that something that's at the national level as well? And now for that, I'm going to talk to Nirmal. So Nirmal, you have been working extensively on the National Crime Record Bureau's AFRS. For those of you who don't know, the AFRS is India's facial recognition system that is in the development stage. It's been in the development stage for the longest time now. It's reported to be the world's largest facial recognition system. When it's deployed, it will have all the details about crime criminals in India. It will be connected to different databases that are already existing or that will be built. For example, police databases. So on the whole, it's a very scary project. And it's been in development for quite some time. But there is very little that we have been actually able to know about it. So how easy or difficult has it been for you to get information around this project, which is going to affect the lives of each and every Indian?
Right. I think it's been 2019, June, around June, July is when the first, the tender came out for the NCRB. Now, AFRS. Now, initially the reaction was, hey, there was no global, there's no national level conversation around this at all, right? So our reaction was, hey, the first thing which we need to answer is, why is this happening, right? What is that? What are those 2, 3, 4 reasons that led to the government making this kind of a move? So I remember reaching out to NCRB back then. Me and my colleague have ever since that reached out at various intervals to these people. Officially, it is unbelievably tough to get them to take a stance on anything, right? So most of the conversation ultimately becomes source based, where you are actually telling somebody and they are coming out of a meeting and then talking to you separately. So it's for a national level system that affects the life of every Indian. This project is shrouded in secrecy. I mean, I would actually compare it to Aadhaar, right? In the initial days of Aadhaar, at least there was a lot more conversation going because, of the names that were involved, like Nandan Nindekani is involved. Therefore, the media in general was more excited and interested in that. While there may be such individuals in the background in these cases, because it's not right up front, and it's actually being run by this boring old National Crime Records Bureau, right? I mean, that name itself is boring for me. Now, because of that, I don't think it has managed to capture the attention of people beyond, I think, beyond the 4-5 of us who write about these things. I don't think it's become a conversation of a larger conversation. So I think it works in both ways. There has not been any communication, any press conference, any sort of willingness to talk from the NCRB. Neither has there been the level of questioning from us in the media that this issue deserves. So yeah, I mean, I thought I still remember, because there were revisions to the initial draft that came out, right? Every few months there were revisions. So after a while, not revisions actually, they were actually pushing the date of the last day of a submission of bids. So me and my colleague, we used to actually make it a game and figure out when is going to be the next what is going to be the next date that these guys are going to come up with. And that, I think there were easily 7, 8, 9, 10. I forgot now that it was as many as that. I think the initial date was September, and finally, I think they decided to drop the initial tender. I think somewhere next year, 2021, around May, June, is when they finally decided to drop it. And then a few months later, they came out with another revised tender. And now the revised tender, for me, it made everything even more ambiguous, if anything. So, but interestingly, I don't see the similar issues of like pushing of dates and all right now. But I think that does not augur well, because I think one of the things that the constant pushing of those dates did is to keep the issue at least in the media spotlight. I fear that right now we are going to a time when they're deliberately lying low so that they can work on something and then present it as something that's been already done. So I fear that. I think the lack of national conversation is worrying for all of us.
Definitely. And as someone who was kicked out of the NCRB meeting for the vendors, I know for a fact how much this entire situation is shrouded in secrecy, because I was not allowed to be there just for the conversation with the prospective vendors as well. So yes, definitely. And I think the lack of conversation is also because there's no forum for reporters and the people who are developing it to actually interact. They've not had press conferences, or they've not had any type of press release. So how do you even interact with them in that situation? So that is also something that is worrying about such a big project. But coming back to Hyderabad, you also did a story on what is happening in Hyderabad, and I want to ask you, leave aside this project that is going to come. Have you seen what is happening in Hyderabad happen in other cities like New Delhi, for example? Are there any similarities between what is happening in Hyderabad and New Delhi and across India, basically?
Yeah, I think Haripriya mentioned earlier about the belief that government can do no wrong, right? So that is, I think, fundamental to every part of the country, right? And I think what is happening is that the way cameras and CCTVs and facial recognition, all of these technologies are being presented to through the country. I mean, that is where things slightly differ, right? In Delhi, for example, I think this is a political hot potato. I mean, every single manifesto, you've got the chief minister of the state proudly tweeting out saying, we are number one in number of cameras which we have put out there in the world, right? I think the issue here is that it's become a political issue, and that equation is in Delhi, especially to safety, right? Especially coming from the problems that we've had in Delhi around women's safety, right? So therefore, I think there is this a political capital that is being made out of the number of cameras that people put out there. Now at least I don't know of any research that's been put out there which connects the number of cameras which are out there to Delhi itself being a safer city right now over the last 7, 8, 9 years when cameras really became popular. But in case of Hyderabad, I think it's slightly different. I think one of the interesting conversations that I had was with Srinivas Kodali, who told me that the roots of this issue in Hyderabad really goes back to like 20, 30 years when you believe that when the culture of governance being digitized became the in thing in Hyderabad, right? So I think you look at I found that an insightful point because you look at the history of the city and the state for the last 20, 30 years and how it's packaged is always as a ease to do business city with single window clearance. When you have that as the underlying principle that you're building governance on, this becomes another just technological layer you add to it, right? So it is not necessarily based on a political imperative as much as this belief that technology can solve all ills, right? So I think that's the primary difference that I've seen especially between these two cities, and I think that broadly encompasses even the other cities that are out there.
One common theme that I have actually noticed, and I think most of us have noticed, is what they've said about women's safety, that this technology is going to increase women's safety. So I wanted to ask Haripriya and you, Nirmal, as well. Do you actually think that these safe cities and these smart city projects that are being launched in all these cities and in the name of women's safety, that they're launching this, is that actually what the officials also say, or is it just a way for them to just increase policing in these cities? Haripriya, if you could go first.
I think in the case of Hyderabad, like Nirmal mentioned, I think women's safety is a much more like an issue that they target in Delhi, where they say we're going to increase the number of cameras to increase safety in public for women, etc. I think Hyderabad's a lot more brazen about it. They're not doing this just from the fact that this is going to increase women's safety. They're sure they're going to be we're going to use this in policing to ensure that citizens are safe, but they're also going to be they have the Samagra Vedika system, where they have an algorithm to essentially take out anyone's details depending on a by need basis. So I think when we talk about women's safe, it would apply to Hyderabad. It's at least if they had said that this is a direct impact on why we're keeping our women safer, but they're essentially saying this is how we keep our city safe for everyone and all sorts of law enforcement, also all sorts of crimes. It can be financial, it could be anything else. They're going to be I need to know that you can't commit any fraud because I can take out all the information pertaining to you at any point. So I don't think it's just so that they can track where you are. It's also with where they connect everything, right? Your tax bills, where you're paying your water tax, where your property tax, how many cars you have. It's not simply a policing issue, but a profile of you that they say that an algorithm can pull out from every existing state database to ensure that you can't do no wrong. So I don't think it's purely a women's safety issue in that sense.
Just to add to that, I think there is this veneration of Singapore that is there across across most of our cities, and especially high in cities that are obsessed with technology-led businesses, right? So, which becomes the model for everybody to follow, right? So this way in which technology is being used for governance, therefore becomes like this nice package that you can sell it to people. You can then say that, oh, my city is closer to becoming the next Singapore than somebody else. So for the longest time, interestingly, Hyderabad had to compete with Bangalore and Chennai for business, and I think it as Srinivas Kodali had mentioned, I think it really goes back to that culture of governance, which is there, where I think that is where the Hyderabad thing is really. It seems to be a city in search of a problem to solve, rather than actually telling that, hey, like Delhi is saying that women's safety is a problem. We understand that, and therefore it becomes easier to an easier political narrative to build on. But I think in Hyderabad it's actually far deeper, so which is very, very worrying.
The only victim is in this entire situation is the right to privacy judgment of the Indian Supreme Court, which has been, completely ignored by, I think, all police departments across the country. And
in fact, this Singapore example is something that the TRS government, when it came to power, said we're going to send our people to Singapore so they learn their policing properly. Like, it's a very explicit thing. It's not even implicit if you talk about Telangana's policing.
Yeah. And when Nirmal mentioned Singapore, I saw Reena laughing. So now I'm going to go to Reena. Reena, you cover surveillance throughout South and Southeast Asia. Is what is happening in India part of a global trend towards increasing reliance on surveillance technology by law enforcement, or other countries where surveillance is decreasing, or the police is saying that we don't want to use it, or it's not necessary, or something like that?
I was laughing because I lived in Singapore for several years, and it's a city with one of the highest concentrations of surveillance cameras, of course. And to me, going from India, it was really puzzling to me, because I also knew Singapore as one of the cities with the lowest crime rates, because that's a refrain you keep hearing about this city. And so I was like, why do they need so many cameras when their crime rate is so low, But of course, that's what it is. There is no correlation between crime and surveillance cameras that are used in facial recognition. But, never let facts get in the way of the government narrative. So I wish I could tell you that India is an outlier and that, surveillance is decreasing in the region, but it's increasing everywhere. And it's increasing in very troubling ways as well. India is actually slightly ahead of the curve, maybe only behind China and South Korea and maybe Taiwan in the number of ways that it deploys facial recognition. So, India uses from like street surveillance to airport check-ins to entry into clubs, whereas most other cities, it's just used for street surveillance. There's not even a pretense that it's being used for other purposes to, make your life easier or more convenient. And what's worrying is that if that's even possible, this is happening in countries with even less of a free media, without much of a legal recourse. And of course, many of these countries don't have data protection laws either. Singapore is an exception, and China has brought in a very strict data protection law lately. Again, Chinese cities with among the highest concentrations of surveillance cameras in the world. And we all know what they're being used for in Xinjiang, for example. China is also a big player in the region, in Southeast Asia, and Sri Lanka as well, for example, Pakistan. So any country that has big infrastructure investments from China as part of, say, the Belt and Road or for other projects, they automatically get these sort of smart city investments, and that means a bunch of surveillance cameras. I would actually say, trying to track surveillance architecture in the region, I would actually say some of the big Chinese firms like Huawei and Megvii are actually better tracked by Western firms than some of the smaller firms in India, which are just deploying this architecture, and you have no idea what they do, what their background is. But again, in many of these countries, there's no tendering process, there's no transparency about the infrastructure, what it's being used for, how the data will be stored, who has access to it. And in recent months, I would say everyone has realized just how dangerous this can be, where we saw with the coup in Myanmar more than a year ago now, where the infrastructure was actually put in place by the democratically elected government. But of course, it's fallen in the hands of the military, which is just deploying it with even greater impunity. In Thailand, where I live, facial recognition is increasing. Systems are being deployed everywhere, but especially in the deep south to keep a watch over the minority Malay Muslims, right? And everywhere it's the same sort of reason that's being trotted out. It's for security purposes. I just have to make one more point about how what's encouraging. I mean, and I agree with Nirmal in terms of how little awareness there is in general about surveillance systems. There's very little discussion in the media, national media, local media. But I have to say, I've been encouraged by the pushback from sort of unlikely quarters. In India, the pushback is coming from organizations like yours, for example, who are trying to educate the broader public about it. In Thailand, it's the Malay Muslims who are pushing back. Some of them are saying, we don't want this. Even if it means that we have to have our SIM cards canceled, for example. I mean, they have to register with their biometrics, which they know is linked to the facial recognition system there. In Myanmar, there are sort of these vigilante groups that are mapping where cameras are in the big cities in Yangon, Naypyidaw, Mandalay, so people can avoid these systems. So resistance is coming from, it's a small group. But it's definitely there. I have to use the same term that Nirmal used, that it's just shrouded in secrecy, and there's very little transparency. There's very little accountability as well, because people can't go to the courts as easily as we can in India, even if that process is long and laborious. It's quite a depressing scenario all around.
I try not to get depressed, but yes, definitely it is moving towards that. And you mentioned Huawei and Megvii, which are big firms that sell surveillance technology. How much of this conversation and the entire narrative that we hear, how much of this do you think is coming from them? How much of that is, buy our products and it will increase security and it will help you target criminals and all that? How much do you think the government and the private sector are hand in hand in this situation with regard to how they're selling and how they're trying to sell the narrative of surveillance to the public?
Well, I think it's a bit of everything, but a lot of the Chinese surveillance systems, they're sort of bundled into larger infrastructure projects. So in Cambodia, for example, China's building casinos and whatever, roads and stuff. In Myanmar, again, China is very deeply involved. So the surveillance systems come bundled in as part of the larger infrastructure projects that China is building for these countries, which are in no position to say no. These are much poorer countries, and they think, that's fine. We have these fancy camera systems and they're going to make our cities safer. So they don't question it. And none of this, of course, is broken down to the public, to the larger public, who only know that China's building this fancy new city with these nice roads and whatever. So there's very little transparency in terms of what the elements are. And like I said, it's usually bundled in with larger infrastructure projects. So they don't really know what they're getting. And when they do, they're pretty happy to have it because, who doesn't like a bit of cool gadgetry in their cities? So it is a bit more complicated because China is such a huge infrastructure player in the Southeast Asia region that countries can't really push back. But even in countries where China is not such a big investor, like the Philippines, for example, they're just rolling out the surveillance systems by themselves. In the Philippines, of course, it's a part of the war on drugs that President Duterte had rolled out, which is very, very questionable, of course. So in most countries, it's framed as, in Thailand, like I said, in the deep south, it's framed as for national security purposes because you've had bombs go off there occasionally. So it's always framed as part of the security safety narrative, and then in the case of China's investments as part of an infrastructure narrative. So
okay. Nirmal, being the consummate journalist that he is, has told me that he has a question for Reena. So I'm going to let Nirmal ask a question and then I'm going to continue with my questions. Go ahead, Nirmal.
Reena, I'm just...
You didn't tell me that I had to take questions from the panel, Anushka. Yes.
I'm just a little curious. There is a pushback to facial recognition in general in the West, right? While some of the Western cities are also as surveilled as some of the cities out here in Asia. What do you think? Is that kind of pushback which is there, systemic pushback which is there in the West? How does that play out over here? You've got the major companies, the Amazons, the Microsofts, taking a stance against facial recognition. So do you see the trickle-down effect, so to speak, happening sometime?
I doubt that very much. I actually see that happening maybe in India, because I really feel, even though you're so depressed about the lack of awareness, I really think the level of awareness in India is slightly higher. Even though, when I look at sort of the average news report, not yours or News Minutes, but, there's really no voice of dissent there. It's some cop praising the system, it's a politician praising the system, and then there's no voice of dissent in the report. There's no balancing view. So I have to bring in China again because it is such a huge player in Southeast Asia, and the Chinese systems are just cheaper and more easily accessible than the Western systems. And, I cite the Myanmar example again, because what's happening in Myanmar, as you may be aware, is, Norway's Telenor, for example, is looking to sell its assets in Myanmar, and a bunch of digital rights groups are saying, please secure the data of your customers in Myanmar, like 18 million customers, before you sell it to them, some military-backed firm. So Western firms can be held to higher standards by digital rights firms, by governments, for example, but no one's holding Chinese firms to any standard, and this goes for local firms in India. Like, who even knows who's putting up these systems? It's very, like, each tender could have, like, each system could be built by 7 or 8 different firms. It's not one single firm. And good luck trying to find all of them and then trying to figure out, like, what part they have. With the Chinese system, really, like, I communicated with Huawei. They don't even bother responding to your queries. Whereas if I were to write to Microsoft or Amazon, I will get a response back. Even if it's like a canned response, I will get a response back. So it's a bunch of Chinese firms. Large Chinese firms. It's a bunch of local firms, like, cobbling together stuff from, like, off-the-shelf software. So they are not being held to account, So I don't see that happening really, unless there are, like, I don't know, unless there's a big Western firm also involved. There are a couple of Israeli firms involved in some projects. So there could be pushback against them, but yeah, I mean, good luck trying to push back against the Chinese firms. So that's not happening.
No. We have a big US firm, Clearview AI is coming, so don't worry about that, guys. And full disclosure, Reena, it's a Panoptic talk. So anybody can ask anybody anything. It's open, it's a conversation. So if you have any questions for the other two, go ahead. But just to circle back to what I was talking about, you have interacted with government officials in India and abroad. So you have that perspective. Is there any similarity to how resistant they are to transparency around these projects and surveillance technology in general?
It's actually far easier to interact with Indian government officials. I mean, at least you can reach someone. There are like phone numbers on the website. I mean, try finding an official in Cambodia or Myanmar, or it's just really hard. There's so little transparency. You can't even find phone numbers to people. There'll be like a general landline number for the department. The minister's name won't even be registered on the website. The Philippines has a little bit more transparency. At least you can find people that you can chase down. Singapore, I have to say, at least responds to queries. They are extremely, all the information they have, including questions in Parliament that are raised and answered, are on the website. You can call the minister or a member of Parliament or their secretary, and you'll at least get a response. Malaysia similarly, but other countries, no. There's not even a way to reach the government officials, let alone getting a response from them. So no. Okay. So I often look at the public agendas for where a minister might be at a public function, and then I chase them down there. I will go to a function which has nothing to do with surveillance, just some kind of public meeting they have. But they like to be asked questions. They love the television cameras, of course, but that's the only way for me to speak to someone in person and get some kind of a response. There's no way you can reach them on email or phone. Thailand, if you need to ask questions, you literally have to fax them or snail mail them questions. So good luck trying to get them to respond. So I literally go and doorstop them at public functions that they may be at.
So you're making us feel better about the bar being so low that we're happy about what is happening in India.
It is a very low bar, yes.
Right. And now that all of us, have talked about transparency in different levels, one of the main legislation for transparency in India is the Right to Information Act. I am assuming all three of you have used it. IFF uses it extensively, and we've had a lot of luck in certain situations and just nothing in some situations. So how helpful do you think RTI, the Right to Information Act, is in trying to get more information and transparency from government officials? Haripriya.
I think, like you said, it's very hit and miss. Like, it's just a shot in the dark, and you hope you'll get information out of it. But I'm not going to deny the RTI is a very important tool, and I cannot downplay that in any measure and be like that. Could we do better? Probably in terms of transparency. But am I going to hinge my hopes that I will get the response that I want from the government? Not necessarily.
Nirmal? You're on mute.
Yeah, I think, yes, the trouble with the RTI, right, is that it really has become person dependent. Who is the bureaucrat on the other side, right? And so there is a process that is there, right? The intent is great. It should be, if it works like it's intended to as a process, it should be the greatest of tools. But the reality is that it is hit and miss, and in my case, more misses than hits. Maybe I'm crafting the questions wrong, but invariably I get the specter of national security is the one which is raised more often than not, right? So maybe I should get tips from you guys to craft better questions.
Happy to help. Let me know.
That's the reality, right? I think.
I mean, it's the same for us. I mean, I feel like 30-70 is the ratio that I would give it, wherein 30% of responses give you something, and 70% of them just nothing. So yeah, I mean, I agree. Reena, have you used it? Have you?
I have.
In other countries.
Well, I mean, in Thailand, there's a Freedom of Information Act, but you have to write, like, there's no digital way to do it. You literally have to write letters. Very few other countries have a way to get information. Singapore is fairly transparent if they choose to be. I'm trying to think if I've had to reach out to other. No, it's very opaque in other places. There is no sort of, and even in India, the RTA has been diluted so much. And it is being diluted across, I mean, it's just being diluted everywhere because they just don't want to answer you. So I think it's becoming less critical to journalism because of the way it's been diluted. So, and very often we're on deadlines, and we don't have the luxury of waiting and waiting and waiting. So you pick up the phone and try and call someone and hope that you find some friendly voice at the other end who will answer some of your questions. So yeah, I mean, I think in sort of longer investigations, then that helps because you can wait and yeah, I mean, someone may say this doesn't concern us or whatever, and then you try someone else or another department or whatever. But otherwise, it's a real test of your patience. So yeah, and that's the aim. I mean, they really want to wear you out. So yeah.
I thank you for your continuous work. I know it can be so frustrating sometimes. I have been extremely frustrated sometimes, so I can imagine what you guys have been through. And now I'm going to actually ask you a little meta question, if I may. When you're reporting around such technology, what do you think a journalist's role is in this situation? Do you think it is relevant to frame the issue with what your opinion is? Do you think it's relevant to provide an opposite view from what the government official or the agency or anybody else is saying? Or do you think you should leave it up to the reader to make up their own mind about how good or bad the technology is? I'm going to ask Reena actually to continue talking about it.
Okay, so at Reuters, we have very strict guidelines about our journalism. It has to be fair and it has to be unbiased. And I'm not writing an opinion piece. It is reporting that I'm doing, and therefore it has to report the facts, not my opinion. But having said that, I really think it's so critical to provide context and sort of the larger, a global context as well. So for example, if we're saying, Lucknow or Hyderabad or Bangalore is installing these facial recognition systems because police say they want to, battle crime or find missing children or whatever, it's very important to bring in the context that there is very little evidence to show that there is a correlation between surveillance, like facial recognition systems, and a reduction in crime. And you can cite a global study. I mean, there are so many of them, right? And I think it's also important to bring in global context, like, several cities in the US or Europe, for example, have banned these systems because of their bias, of their inbuilt biases against minority communities and people of color. And I think journalists do a great disservice in not providing that context for readers to understand the story in its entirety. I recognize fully well the challenges of word limits and deadlines and whatever, but it's literally one paragraph or two that you can boilerplate and just throw into the story, because that has not changed, you know. And I really think for people in India, for people in Thailand, whatever, it's so crucial to provide that global context, to say this is being done not just here, but other countries. And there are other countries that have banned these systems because they have found them to be so faulty, you know. So that context is very, very important. I don't think journalists should take a stand because we are reporters. I mean, if you want to take a stand, write an opinion piece and call it that, you know. But it's always crucial to seek the other side. So, you know, speak to you, for example, on a story on facial recognition systems. And yeah, I would just say that, you know, make sure that both sides are represented, make sure that the global context is provided, regional and global context is provided. Yeah, that's what I would say.
Okay, Haripriya?
I agree. I think in the same way, I think the final two paragraphs at least will always give that larger context rather than just a press release or whatever the information that has been put out. But I think even, like, for example, I think in the last couple of years, every story in India has had this, you know, that we don't have a data protection law and we don't know what is happening to our and how it's being processed, or whether there's any checks and balances in place. But I think we also, we obviously can't have an opinion, but I think we do have a slant in some sense, like where we will sort of say that facial recognition is not the greatest thing, or like Dina mentioned, cool gadgetry that we make it out to be, and that we instead have to talk about the realities and the problems of it. So I'm not saying there might not be a slant, but I will very well make my case for why it is. And if there's a dissenting view, then obviously that will be included as well. So I'm not saying I'm just going to put my opinion out and say facial recognition is bad and nothing else. I will very well make my case for it in the piece that I'm writing. But I do think there will be a slant somewhere where I will probably, it'll take a lot more to be like, this is a good system that has all its checks and balances in place.
Okay, Nirmal.
I agree with both of them, but I also think that there is a problem in great narrative-based reporting, you know, or lack of it actually in India right now. You know, I think some of these issues need far deeper reporting than I think we've managed so far, and I think that's our mistake, frankly, right? So you know, the context can't always be about the two paragraphs which are there, you know, at the end, frankly, right? So, you know, how do we make this conversation more identifiable for people, right? It is, see, right now, I think this is something that is seen as, you know, things that matter to a bunch of intelligentsia, you know, and not to the ordinary folk. I think one of the things that where we, all of us, probably could do better is in telling the story of how these tools are being used by the cops in each of these cities. What is the exact nature of the you know, violations of our fundamental right to privacy that is happening right now. I think for whatever it's worth, the kind of bandwidth that we have, you know, we've failed ourselves, frankly, in not reporting enough from the ground. So I think making the whole issue of facial recognition, equating it with the gross violations of privacy, and doing it and packaging this whole narrative in such a way that everybody can identify with it. I think that is a sweet spot that all of us could could do better with.
Yes, agree. I think, yeah, it's very hard to sometimes not, tell somebody how you feel about it, just to be objective in certain situations. So I agree with all three of you that it's very important to remain objective even when you're telling both sides. And that is the
It's
end of
difficult.
my
It's really difficult, Anushka.
It's
So,
very difficult. Believe me, it's so difficult. But that is the end of my questions. Thank you so much to all three of you for coming here to answer my questions today, when I am the one who's usually answering all your questions. Now I'm going to ask a couple of audience questions. And one of them is really interesting, and I'm going to contextualize it a bit. From what I've seen in movies and TV shows, about journalism and reporting and everything, there's one thing that I remember is don't make yourself the story, right? You have to stay out of it or something like that. But for example, if a reporter is covering a protest, and at that protest, facial recognition technology is being used to identify you, then in that situation, how does that journalist experience, how much of that is reporting and how much of that is just what has happened to you, and how do you remain objective in such a situation when you are the story? Anybody can take it.
I'm going to jump in very quickly. This is not in the Indian context. This actually happened in Bangkok. As you may be aware, there were these massive street protests in Bangkok last year, calling for a change in the constitution and for the monarchy to be, less intrusive and whatever. Anyway, so the cops were using facial recognition to identify troublemakers, as they were called, including media, including press, who wore their press vests, and they were supposed to wear like a black armband or something that clearly identified them as press, and yet they were still arrested. And the stories were reported initially by their colleagues because these guys were just hauled away to jail, and then a few of them wrote first-person accounts. But that was clearly not. It was a first-person account which was framed as a witness piece or an opinion piece, and the centerpiece of those articles were not that facial recognition was used on me, but cops were using force on the media who were there to do their job to cover a protest. Which I thought was a really sort of mature and valid point to make, because people who were reading it were more interested in the fact that the media, that journalists and photographers were being arrested simply for doing their job at a protest, rather than get into this whole sort of, this is why facial recognition is bad. So I do think there's a place and a time for telling certain stories. And I was really struck by how calmly they use that platform to make the broader point about media freedom, rather than this is why facial recognition is bad, to be fair, to be honest, those stories never even came afterwards, although I was like, but what about the facial recognition that they used to arrest you? Surely there has to be a discussion about it, but for whatever reason they chose to not make that the main thrust of their story, and which I thought was, the media freedom took precedence that day, and I thought it was done in this really sort of mature and calm fashion, which told people why they should care about the story and why they should care about journalists being arrested, which on that day was the bigger story than the fact that facial recognition was being used. So that's just one example from me.
Anybody else has any input? Okay. One last question. So I'm just going to read it out. What is the reaction of people under these facial recognition systems, since many people also seem to support them? If yes, why? I think this is again the whole privacy and secrecy debate, right? So if anybody can take it. Nirmal, I see you unmuted. Oh,
sorry.
Go ahead, Arpia, go ahead.
Okay, sorry. I think things change when they themselves have been profiled. Again, I'm going back to Hyderabad as an example. When they've been stopped on the road and a camera has been shoved in their face to take a picture because they've been profiled as a specific type of troublemaker, I think their opinion changes at that point, where they suddenly, because they're at the center of it makes them uncomfortable, because suddenly there's a cop who not only has your details, but has taken your picture and is going into this system. So I think until it gets to something that's very personal to them, I think we come back to the same privacy versus secrecy debate, where we will believe that, again, I'm slightly deviating here, but in Hyderabad, there were colonies who were essentially going to the cops and said, check this entire colony because it's next to the college. And we believe there's troublemakers here. So they'll go from house to house and ask them about if there's any sort of activity going on. That is a very problematic thing, that a cop can randomly show up because someone believes that this is a problematic thing to do. So unless it gets to a very personal, I have a camera shoved in my face and something has happened to me because of facial recognition software, I think we as journalists have to do a better job at explaining the privacy versus secrecy debate to people in a way that they understand it, and not just be like, I have nothing to hide, and like you mentioned, that governments can do no wrong.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think we are a trust deficient country, right? I mean, we don't necessarily trust each other, right? So I think in that context, it has to be storytelling that really tells the experience of individuals. I think it has to be ground up, storytelling that really not just people to sort of see it in different context, and I'm hope there's actually only so much that print and I think if there is more visual media coverage of some of these issues, I think there would be more of I think at the moment this is something that we in print and digital maybe write about. I think visually to depict some of these stories, I think might actually make it somewhat more identifiable for people out there. And it would be great to have more television news, more even bloggers, YouTubers, all of these kinds of folks also coming along and contextualizing it, because there is an issue here. I think the closest correlation is how the free basics issue during that time, the Save the Internet campaign, how that made a difference, because suddenly it was demystified. It was actually made something that somebody could tweet about, and somebody could just share and understand, hey, what is the problem here, and therefore, so I think that kind of intervention here would be great, and I think it would make all of our lives easier also when we narrate some of these stories.
Definitely. I can't tell you when, so not that he's a journalist or anything, but John Oliver did one of his pieces on facial recognition. I was so happy because I was like, oh my God, John Oliver is talking about it. So at least it'll get some attention. But obviously I was in the US. But still, some people do follow him in India as well and listen to him. So I was very happy. And that is correct, actually. The issue is how to make it, not to sound shallow, but how to make it catchy enough for people to care about. Yes, I think that is something that has to be resolved if we want people to understand why this is such a big issue.
I think it's also that we have to move this into regional languages. I think we're very much trapped in English. And that's the issue, that we have to move this into our local languages that people will watch and forward on WhatsApp and understand. It has to be catchy, but it also has to be in a language that they understand more easily than, and like Nirmal mentioned, it feels like an intelligentsia problem and not a general problem. And unless we break that down into local languages in India, I don't think that will change much.
I see, definitely, and I've always been trying to do that, not just English, but also Hindi and other regional languages, not just our work on facial recognition, but all of our work, that we try to cater to not just a bunch of specific Indians, but to all Indians basically. And that brings us to the end, and which is perfect because it's exactly 6. I would want to thank all of you, Haripriya, Nirmal, Reena, for taking the time to come and talk to us today. I also want to thank the entire IFF team that helped make today's event happen, which includes Shivani and Ashlesh, who work with me on organizing these events. And lastly, I want to thank our community, which engages with us so eagerly and purposefully whenever we organize such an event. If you are interested in volunteering for Project Panoptic, please do write to me at anushka@internetmedium.in. And thank you to everyone who attended the talk today, and I'll see you in the next one.